Hello, welcome back to Janus Academy. This is an ongoing series on history of art, general introduction to history of art, where we are dealing with one particular artifact, still not works of art per se. We're going to explain that yet again, per particular period that we're talking about. Today we're opening 3 chapters that are going to be dedicated to Aegean art. So today we're talking about the first part of the Aegean art, which is Cycladic or Cycladic art. What we're going to be talking about here is going to be represented by a figurine, very small figurine, that is the harp player. This figurine is roughly 4,600 years old. Now, it's an estimate, of course, because we have some 300 to 400 years of uncertainty where exactly, and that is when exactly this is coming from. But let's say, broadly speaking, it's 4,600 years old. This is a very curious and interesting artifact. Now, again, we're not quite yet saying the work of art because it's too early for that. When we're talking about Cycladic art, we are talking about the islands, the Cyclades, that are situated between today's Greece and today's Turkey, between the southeastern part of European continent and what we call Asia Minor. This is, of course, interesting and important because we are talking about, well, the Mediterranean region, and we're talking about the part of the Mediterranean that is very close, geographically speaking, to the interesting part of the world back in the day, which we know as the Fertile Crescent, which we know as the place where civilization came from, the place where agriculture was invented, where first cities appeared, and when then that impulse started changing the world. Now, we are talking again about the very heavy communication that exists between these different parts of the Mediterranean. In particular, this one is quite busy, and this one is obviously also present in the Mediterranean trade, which means a lot of syncretism, which means a lot of influences, and which means a lot of cross-pollination of ideas, of concepts, and of course of artifacts. How we build them, what is their purpose, and everything else that has to do with it. When we're talking about Cycladic art in general, again, we're not fully talking about art, and I'll keep making this mistake because this is just how you see it in a lot of art histories and a lot of articles dedicated to this topic, but this is still not art per se. We are talking about 3 different ways of representing things. The 3 different ways are schematical, naturalistic, and basically an amalgamation of the 2. We call these pelos and plastiras, and it has pretty much to do with where they were discovered, with their location. We are talking about schematic figurines that will follow a certain pattern of stylization, and then we're talking about more naturalistic figurines that are more generally close to what humans look like. Now, we need to say what we also said for many previous lectures, that we don't really know what these were for. And we can't know for certainty if they represented humans or gods, if they represented fetishes or daimons, if they represented just regular common people or something entirely different, because we still don't have writing present in this period at the time. Now, this is the period in which slowly writing starts emerging, and we have writing in the places that, we generally tend to call the Fertile Crescent, but more specifically in Mesopotamia. It starts becoming a thing in Babylon, and then it starts becoming a thing in Egypt. But in this part of the world, though it is connected to these other regions, we still don't have writing. And this is a really important thing for us to properly understand this particular work of art. Again, an artifact, and what it was for and what it represents. And we just needed to affirm this early on to say that we don't have traces of writing here quite yet. And when you think about traces of writing, when you think about literacy and writing things down, it's a very important thing. We're going to get to the point in history where we're talking about generally all these things and how they influence one another, and how we cannot talk about the world the same way before and after writing. Now, you will notice that our previous entry, though we tried to keep it chronologically to a certain extent, is younger than this one. When we were talking about Ishtar, or representation of Queen of the Night, that we assume to be Ishtar, this is something that was made 3,800 years ago. In a way, it's younger than this particular next item, well, the one that we are referring to today. But we decided to do this chronological shift to a certain extent so that we could talk about three things that shape Aegean art together, so that we can bring them together. So we're going to be talking about Cycladic art in this particular case, then later Minoan art, and then later geometric style. And yes, so this is like a bit of a change from our usual generally chronological approach, and we wanted to situate these three thematically because they form what will later become, well, the Hellenistic world, what we're later going to start addressing as Greece. And we can say that these are all pre-Greek artifacts that will influence what will eventually become Greek art. So this is just to clarify this little situation, not to say confusion. Now, when we're talking about this particular figurine, we want to describe it a bit first. We want to say what it looks like, and we want to say really what's it all about. First of all, it's like a very cute figurine. I have to open with this, well, subjective impression, really, because it is. It just looks so incredibly sweet. We don't know who made it, of course. This is still an unknown artist. I mean, kind of obviously, really. And it's a fairly small object. Now, the way this is made is that it represents a composition and I would say artistry that is quite challenging. This is a very well-made figurine. It's made of marble, which again is a solid material, noble material. And it was basically ground down using pumice and emery, very abrasive materials that were locally available. So it was basically shaped from a solid block of marble. And if you think about, I mean, if you look at the whole work and if you see just how refined it is and how elegant it is, how polished it is, it's quite remarkable. We can say that this is not something that speaks of limitations, something we were dealing with earlier when we were talking about certain materials that were available or certain tools that were available. So we were talking about how these were limited one way or the other. When we look at this figurine, we can say that it's very well made and that it represents us a situation that looks very familiar to us. This is basically a person playing a harp. They sit on a chair, so this is another familiar item, and they're playing an instrument. Now, already we're talking about civilization as such. We have a chair, we have an instrument, this is already a lot, anthropologically speaking. And we have this very interesting situation where, well, the figurine is fully formed. They have legs, they have feet, they have hands and arms. These are all very, very important. And then, of course, they have a head. Very long neck. We're going to go back to the very long necks of Cycladic art in general, not just this particular figure. And what we can also see with this instrument, probably we're going to go back to this as well in a while, is this idea of how it's made. Since it's made from solid block of stone, but also since artistically this was obviously the intent, it looks like the instrument is integrated with the figure. It looks really like the instrument is emerging out of the body. All the more because, well, the instrument and the body are made from the same material. Obviously, they're the same block of marble. But further than that, we can see that it really looks like the music player here is playing himself in a way. There's this interesting merger between these two. Now, we need to, state right away that this is a male harp player. Of the early Speedos type. This is yet another type that we have emerging in Cycladic art. But this is really something that is quite important to state right away, that this is a male figurine. And the reason why this is so is that we don't really have a lot of these. Roughly 5% of all of Cycladic figurines are male. 95% are female. there is a very strong focus on female figurines. And there is a thing that needs to be said, is that female figurines are probably more important. Now, why do we say this? Well, because when we look at male figurines, they're mostly doing something. Like this particular guy is playing a harp. But when we look at female figurines, they're not doing anything. They're just standing there, in a position of arms crossed in most cases. So this tells us that these male figurines are there with a specific role. They have a certain role in this particular society, in this community, whereas women don't need to have a role to be represented. They are just enough on their own. This is a really important thing, and we're going to come back to it later when we start talking about the importance of male and female individuals in this particular society, and when we start talking about the possible class division that this meant. Now, one of the things that we can say about these figurines when it comes to Cycladic art is that a lot of them were used for burials, and we found them next to burial sites. This is a very important thing to address because it takes us back to the figures of Angazal in Jordan that predate these for a couple of thousands of years. We don't really know what they were for, but we see them very likely involved in the cult of burial, in the ritual of burial. So this is a very important thing. We have this whole idea that they were buried together with the people that they were intended for. Perhaps they were votive offerings, perhaps they represented people that were buried. And perhaps they were basically like a duplicate image of the people that were buried. Now, this tells us something about the sacrificial ritual that possibly had to do with this. Now, we are talking about the period in history where we are already well into the agricultural era, which means that this region is also on its way on having this mode of production. And when we're talking about the agricultural period, we are talking about all of the rituals of burial having a lot to do, very likely, with the very process of agriculture, meaning that if you bury a person, you're likely going to look at that entire act as basically planting the seed, that you are returning something to the soil, like it's said in the Bible, that you came from dust and dust you will return. But it's also this, not just this cyclical idea that you arise from the ground, you eat from the ground, you are made from earth, from the soil, but also is that when you offer yourself back to the soil, that you are going to come back one way or the other, that you are going to come back as greater in a way than what you were when you entered the soil. Because again, you think about how wheat functions, or any other grain, really any other corn. You plant one seed, but then many seeds emerge from it. And we can say that the idea of offering these artifacts was possibly a thing, but also possibly they represented the person that was being buried. There is also this connection that exists between these and figures of Angazal that were also buried, that were broken, and then they were made, they were broken, and then they were buried in pieces. So this is basically something that tells us about the funerary culture and about the sedentary characteristic of this, sedentary character rather, of this entire society, that they had a strong focus on the soil, and they saw themselves as being a part of the natural cycle. Now, we can also go back to this whole idea of, burial and fertility, how they have to do with one and the same thing. That you bury a person as a sort of a sacrificial offering, especially if you think about people living in much smaller communities and people generally thinking other people are more important than we tend to do nowadays. Especially those of us who live in large cities where we are surrounded by immense crowds and where we are more likely to be annoyed by those crowds and the noise and everything than we are to fully comprehend the value of another. This is not the case in these small, very tightly knit communities, because every person is much more important than we can even imagine today. Which means that if you bury a person, this is a sort of a sacrificial offering, and it takes us back to one of the ways in the, performing a sacrifice from this part of the world was to bury a pregnant pig while it is still alive, which is a very cruel thing in so many ways, but you can kind of understand the whole idea of fertility and the whole idea of offering a sacrifice so as to please the soil and to please the gods, and so as to have a more bountiful harvest. And we can assume that these had to do with that. Now we're going to come back to the whole idea of music and how it's really that important, how we got to basically choose between many of these figurines and why the choice landed on the musician, on the harp player. But I want to go back to this whole idea of fertility and burial, this whole idea of a very peculiar look at the complex that Freud called eros and thanatos, two sides of the same coin, two aspects of the same force, the force of life and the force of death, how they come together. And what I want to suggest is that these are seen in a strongly agricultural point of view, because again, these are burial figurines. I want to also address the fact that this is something that is very close to our idea of civilization. I mean, not incredibly close, but certainly much closer than artifacts we were discussing in previous chapters. And this is something that tells us how we are approaching contemporary idea of civilization. What I want to talk about is the fact that, first of all, this figurine is seated on a chair. Second of all, that it's playing an instrument. Now, if you're thinking about this figurine being a votive offering or being a sacrifice or being in any way connected to the cycle of life, these are very important things. These are very important topics. Your community basically depends on your harvest succeeding or not. Now, if you're creating something that is a part of this sacred context, you're generally going to include only what you think is really important. We can say this because earlier figurines that we were discussing would represent just a face or just the body, or they would represent the body but with no feet and with no hands. There would be this idea, as primitive as it may be, that we only represent what is truly important. Now, when it comes to this figurine, not only do we have, all of it represented, the entire body with all of its details. I mean, not all of them, it's still a very stylized figurine, but what I'm saying is it has feet, it has hands, it obviously has, fingers that are also defined, very important. But we also represent two interesting items, a chair and a musical instrument. Now, if we are to adopt this idea that we only represent what is truly important, not only on account of, representation itself, but on account of how much time it takes to make these, how these people take a lot of time to make these fetishes, which means that they're very important. So you're going to represent what is important. This tells us that chairs are very important, that musical instruments are very important. And we're going to get to that when we start talking about music. But I wanted to suggest that this is a moment that, unlike many of the previous figurines that we were talking about, represents something as seemingly banal as a chair is. You don't necessarily think of a chair as a terribly important, object. I mean, you can think of a throne in a way, be it a throne of a bishop, the cathedra, or being be it a throne of a king, or whichever other thrones that exist in the world. So you can say, okay, sure, those are important, but this is not a throne. I mean, this is a very plain-looking chair, which I think, at least in my opinion, makes it even more important because it's more universal, it's more general. But, you could have easily represented this figurine just seated, like on a rock or something, or just not seated at all, playing a harp standing up. You didn't have to bother to create a chair because, again, with limited resources and with limited time, representing a chair would mean that it's something that really matters. And I would argue that what really matters about it is this, fantastic thing when it comes to chairs is that, as you can plainly see from this particular figurine, and as you can see when you, for example, visit the Louvre Museum in Paris and when you go to the Egyptian section, is that the chairs didn't really change that much. They look pretty much the same as the chairs look today. Now, you can look around you, wherever you are, if you're in some sort of a house or an apartment, And you're likely to find a chair that looks exactly like this one. We didn't really enhance this invention for, well, thousands of years. And if you think about this figurine being over 4,000 years old, you can say, okay, well, these chairs remain pretty much the same, which means that we've invented them right the first time around. But this tells us about literally sedentary society. I mean, you use chairs to sit down, so it's sedentary action. And it tells us about their importance. And we're going to talk about that a bit later again when it comes to music. Now, speaking about the instrument, this is a really important thing. Harp comes from the Middle East. And this is, well, kind of in between the Middle East and Europe, Cycladic Islands. So it's not really that important to note where is this particular instrument coming from, as much as it is important to understand that this particular region is obviously open to influences from other parts of the world. This is not an isolated work of art. Again, not a work of art, artifact. So this is not an isolated community, and quite the opposite. This is the community that obviously has contact with all the other communities and that is obviously open to influences from all the other communities, as much as it is projecting perhaps its own influence onto these other communities. And if they're displaying an instrument, that comes from the Middle East, we can say that, well, obviously these influences, these communications are kept alive, they're kept open, which again helps us understand this society better. It helps us to understand what this is all about. Now, when we're looking at this harp further, we can say that it looks like it has a bird's beak on top of it. You can see this, well, protrusion on the very top of the instrument that makes us think of, well, a bird. And this is tremendously important because again, we're going back to this whole idea of animal-human hybridity that we were talking that much about when it came to, well, Ishtar, when it came to Egyptian artifacts, when it came to, well, the very beginning of our entire intervention, when it came to Lovenmensch. So it's a really, really big deal. And when we start talking about Minoan civilization, of course, we're going to mention the Minotaur. You can't really talk about the Minoans without mentioning the Minotaur. The whole idea being that this animal-human hybridity is something that persists and something that we're going to, well, keep bumping into as we progress. And even when we get to, well, Renaissance art and Baroque art and classical and neoclassical art, we're going to keep bumping into animal-human hybridity. Something that we said about Ishtar, Queen of the Night, is that we have this peculiar idea of humanity that involves both the animal realm, the divine realm, and the human realm, strictly speaking, in a, how should I say, more focused, more narrow meaning of the term. And this is to say that we see humans in a way that is much larger and I would say, well, truer to nature than what we do today. Because when today we think about what humanity is, we are very much under influence, aware or not, of Cartesian school and of that whole hyper-focus that we have on reason that is a very reductionist point of view. Again, I'll repeat this many times over, so be ready for that. But in the old world, certainly pre-Christian world, when we think about what human is, what humanity is, and a lot of artifacts and a lot of art and a lot of our idea of the sacred is basically on this topic. We are trying to contemplate and we're trying to understand what a human is. We see humans being animalistic and being as animals as well. And in this particular case, it's interesting because we can see this instrument, again, kind of growing out of the body of this figurine. They're playing the instrument and they seem to be taken by music. I want to come back to this a bit later. But there's an animal aspect of this instrument. Now, why is this so interesting? Well, first of all, it's the instrument itself that grows out of the body. But there is the animal aspect of the instrument. Now, when we're thinking about instruments, we are thinking about tools in a certain way. So you could be a bit blunt and crass about it, and you could say that, well, musical instruments are also musical tools. I mean, it's the truth in a way, if you broaden the definition a bit. And if we're talking about tools, we are talking about, well, a certain level of civilization, a certain level of separation from the natural world. Because again, to go back to the example of a tool, If you take a tool to do something, you're not doing it with your bare hands, so you're losing the immediacy of that experience. Your communication is no longer with the world as it is, it's with the tool, and then the tool communicates with the world. So we see this as an act of separation from nature, as we've addressed it previously. But here we see an animal, the bird, being a part of the tool. So we see it being integrated back into what is supposed to be a material object that represents our level of civilization, which in many cases is seen as our level of separation from nature. If we go back to this whole dichotomy, society and nature, the more we move towards society, the more we remove ourselves from nature, and vice versa. But here we see an interesting way to patch it all together. And we see that, again, the idea that these people have of animals and the animal realm is not necessarily the one we have. They don't see animals as less intelligent than we are. They don't see them as less elegant. Quite the opposite in many cases. So in this particular case, we can perhaps make a connection between how the birds sing and how they can create beautiful music themselves. And we can say that, okay, music is definitely one of the arts. It belongs to the muses. I mean, muses, music. There's an etymological connection, museum comes from there as well. The whole idea being that music is one of the most sophisticated arts there are. Hegel thought that it was possibly the greatest of all arts, but it was too tactile to be the greatest of all arts. It was just too sensual. But anyhow, music is always given a very high position in this extremely futile attempt to classify arts by their value. The whole point being that here we have this whole idea of a very sophisticated, elevated art, and an instrument that is used to play, music connected to the animal realm, to the animal kingdom. And I find this is really interesting. Also, we want to talk about how playing instruments and dealing with music really has a lot more to do with nomadic societies than it does with sedentary societies. Now, it really depends on the instrument. You can say that you can't really imagine a piano being a nomadic instrument, like a large concert piano. Obviously, you're not going to be able to move that around very successfully. I mean, in pre-agricultural and pre-industrial conditions, when we're talking about instruments, we're talking about, small portable things. And we are talking about the fact that, the flute was the first instrument to be invented. I think the first flute we have is 26,000 years old, I think. I'm not entirely certain. I have to go back and check that. Now, the thing is that when we're talking about music, we are talking about this connection between Paleolite and Neolite, like Paleolithic and Neolithic, the Old Stone and the New Stone societies. And we're talking about something that, again, if we go back to the flute, coming basically from Paleolithic circumstances, we can say that there has been a transition that connects, nomadic societies to sedentary societies, and that we can see, again, this connection between the two being made in this figurine as well. A harp is not as easy to transport. It's not quite as portable or as mobile as a flute is, but the point remains the same, that we have an artificially made instrument that is used for music. And we have a bit of a merger between these two ways of, I wouldn't say lifestyles. I mean, it is kind of that, but it's not really modes of production, not really either. Two ideas of society, let's put it that way. And we want to say that this is an incredibly complex thing here. We have to stop ourselves because this is really important. If we're talking about what is going on here in this statue, we can see a person playing a harp and very likely singing while they're playing a harp. And this is why I like this statue so much. This is why I chose it to talk about it, and not some of the female fetishes that possibly held a greater importance for this particular society. It's this idea that the person playing this is depicted with such exceptional style and skill, and I would also argue care and love. Because we can see this person being transported by the music they're creating. We can see them singing and possibly humming. And as simple as their head and face are made, they look really to be in the music. I think this is such an amazing thing, that you can see this highly stylized statue, but you can really feel the mood in which it's in. It doesn't really matter that when it comes to its face, the only thing we can see is the nose, but you can really feel like the music. And this is amazing. If you're talking about something that was made anywhere between 2700 and 2300 BCE, and how they were able to capture the mood, and how they were able to make a static, artifact. It's a statue, therefore it's static. But you can kind of feel them swaying, and you can feel them singing and humming. So there's something very dynamic, and it's filled with spirit. So this is really, really nice. But why is this so important? Not just because it's well made, and not just because it's so evocative of a moment that this person was having, but because of the role that music has in this particular society. Now, we're not just talking about music here. This is a thing to understand, and this is so important, is that we are talking about music and singing at the same time. Today, when we think about singing, when we think about music or poetry, they're all really connected. We are thinking about, arts. And arts, as lofty as our idea of what they are can be, are basically reduced to a pastime. They're reduced to secular culture. If you're going to a museum, you're either going for, your schooling, or because your parents are forcing you to go there, or because this is basically your spare free time. And this is, something, again, that really only has to do with the society after the French Revolution and after the Industrial Revolution started happening. But if we're talking about this particular period, so 4,600 years in the past, we are talking really about society in itself, the kernel of civilization. We're talking about tradition, culture, but not in a secular, but in a sacred key. We're talking about education, about communal life. You can think about people gathering around the fire to tell stories. And when they do that, when they're telling those stories, they're basically telling mythical narratives. They are recounting how the world came to be. They're passing knowledge. This is as close as we get to schooling when we're talking about these societies, because this is how they educate their children and their adults. This is the very essence of communal life, that you get to this particular point, the communal gathering, and you're listening to the singing. So it's not just playing an instrument, it's also singing. If you look at the face, as again reduced as it may be, of this figurine, you can see that they're singing as they're playing an instrument. And you then say, okay, but this is such an important thing. This is everything. This is what the myth is made of. As I was taught in university, myth comes after the ritual. And what we have here is really ritualistic. We have this person singing and, telling a story, the most important story, I would imagine. So the story can be about pretty much anything, but the very fact that it's being shared with the community makes it important. Now, we can say, okay, we don't really know if this singer and the instrument player here was talking about the origin of the universe, or they were talking about how gods came to be, or how humans came to be, or the great hunt and the great celestial drama, or they were just recounting on what they've done, last Tuesday. We don't really know, but it doesn't really even matter that much. Because the very fact that they have gathered the community, that they are there to share a moment, that it's congregational in a way, that is what is important. So the very fact that you have a person playing an instrument, singing a story, a narrative, that's what's important about this. And then we go back to the whole funerary practice and the whole funerary usage of these figurines. And we say, okay, so this figurine is about something that is so important for the community, about the communal life itself. If we are burying this, that has tremendous meaning. And if this is a seed that is to produce a lot of other fruits, if it's to blossom and give us many other such instances, that means something. It's a very, very complex thing. And I don't think that we can ever fully understand this. I don't think we can ever fully embrace how different this communal share of culture, communal sharing of culture is as compared to how we enjoy it today. I mean, you could argue that today, if you go to the theater or if you go to the cinema, which happens less and less, by the way, because of streaming services and all of that, you are practicing a sort of a communal ritual. And cinemas and theaters do have that role, that dimension. But you can also argue that if you go to the cinema, I mean, especially if you live in a very large city, you're not always going to meet the same people there. You're not going to recognize all of the faces, and then it's not going to be a shared experience quite the same way as if you go to, let's say, a cinema in a small city or a village, and you know everyone you see there because, let's say, the whole village came to see the movie. And then that whole movie experience is very similar, very akin to the Sunday Mass, for example, where you expect to see the entire community. It's essentially not exactly the same, but very similar. And this unity is lost if you live in a large city and you go to, well, random cinemas, or you always go to the same cinema, but you never really see the same people there. And this is important for us to understand that these figurines came from a society where if you would gather around a person singing and playing an instrument and telling an important story, a story that was made important just by the presence of the community, you were always going to see the same faces. And then that had a ritualistic meaning. It had repetitive meaning that gave it a ritualistic value and ultimately understanding. And this is really something that was so important to address. Now, I want to say how incredibly influential these figurines were to the early 20th century, to this whole craze that defined the early 20th century, what we call as the avant-garde, what we see as this explosion of creativity and people that had crazy new ideas, that were trying to reshape art, that were trying to invent all these new stuff. We're going to get to that period, so we're going to talk about all of that in greater detail. But we really need to say that a lot of this invention of something new and daring and provocative and scandalous and whatnot was basically just rehashing whatever was made, thousands of years ago. We're going to be talking about this when we get to, geometric art, when we get to Minoan art. And as we progress, we're going to keep coming back to this notion. I mean, obviously, Egyptian art is so incredibly influential. But in this particular case, we are talking about people, again, like Picasso, like Brancusi, like Modigliani, who were absolutely enamored with these figurines. They were absolutely enamored with how they were stylized and how they were incredibly simple, yet incredibly evocative and incredibly powerful. Their power came from their simplicity. And their power came from, the sheer fact that they were quite mysterious. I mean, if something is this simple, it leaves a very large place for us to speculate and try to understand what they were. So it's more as if they were keeping their secrets than that they were communicating them. And we need to understand that this is the period of time when people are, arguing about what the art is supposed to be, how they're formulating or they're trying to formulate an entirely new approach to art that is secular, removed from the church and all of that, but how they're also seeking for something that is existentially important, something that is substantial, and something that has a lot of substance. And they find a lot of that substance in these figurines. And you can say that they were so popular and so influential that people like, Modigliani made a lot of them themselves. They made a lot of copies. And sometimes it's hard to tell if the figurines we're looking at were copies made by artists of the early 20th century that were enamored and fascinated by them, or they were like the genuine items. Of course, you can do carbon dating, but still. It's the point to be made is that they were so inspiring and they were so influential that we just felt this incredible urge to make them ourselves, to copy them, to repeat them. And if you look at, you can Google this yourself very easily. You can see the whole row of Modigliani statues, and then of Brancusi, of course, that are replicas, like really almost carbon copy replicas, copy paste, replicas of these figurines. Now, a thing to be said is that since they're so old and since they come from a society that didn't have a writing quite yet, we can't really tell what they were for. And they did have a function, that we can say for sure, but we don't really know what it is. And this was something that left a lot of space for speculation. And this is something that contributed to their mystique, although they were possibly not at all mysterious, nor they had anything to do with mysteries, certainly not initiatory mysteries, to use that term properly. It's just that we saw them as such. We see them as quite hermetic, and we are trying to understand what they were. That's not necessarily to say that they were seen this way by their own society that produced them. Perhaps they were, who knows, but we just can't tell. The whole point being that, this is how we appreciate them today. Now, there's a very important thing about this that can help us understand the whole societal hierarchy a bit better, and that can help us understand the societal division of this particular period. And this is really the point to be made about their very long necks. That these figurines are known not only for their flat faces that only have noses defined and sculpted, but also their very long necks. Now, depending on the statue, they would have longer or shorter necks, but this is really what stands out when it comes to Cycladic art. Very long necks. Now, we can say that, we can go back to how Camille Paglia saw Egyptian art and how she saw it as the birth of elegance, and how this whole idea of a long neck is the idea of elegance. But then we can also go back to the animal world, which is obviously a very strong inspiration for all of these different artifacts that were made in different time periods. If we're talking about, Neolithic and Paleolithic times, we have to think about the animal world as well as being very present and being very influential. Now, why am I talking about the animal world if we're talking about how long your neck is? Well, your neck is a very sensitive area. That's the area that connects your head to the rest of your body. And if you want, to gravely harm a person or murder them, I guess the easiest thing to do is to go for their neck. Head has a skull. A skull is really tough, actually surprisingly tough. The strongest bone in your body is the tip of your skull. And so in a way, your head is more structurally sound than your neck is. Your neck possibly is the weakest part of your body, though for men it may be something else, but we're not going to go there right now. The whole idea being that in the animal kingdom, again, many animals kill by going for the neck, not all of them. And a very important thing is that if an animal is to show its appreciation of another animal, if they want to show that they acknowledge the other animal as superior, as dominant, they present their necks. That's how they show their, inferior position, and that's how they acknowledge authority. If you present your neck, it's also a sign of trust. It's basically, okay, I'm putting my life into your hands to do, or into your jaw, rather, if we're talking about the animal kingdom. Do with it what you like. So it's an act of trust. And this act of, submission, that is also an act of trust, really is something that tells us about animal hierarchies, because animals have those too. And it tells us about the whole societal arrangement. Now, it's quite interesting that, again, to go back to Camille Paglia's idea about Egypt, that if you want to have any kind of social stratification, it has to be based on those two things. Not only those two things, but also those two things. It has to be based on trust. You willingly offer your life and safety to someone else, so there's a lot of trust involved, but you also acknowledge their superior positions, so there's a lot of submission involved. And if you think about vertically structured societies, you have to have both. Now, purely opportunistically speaking, you're not going to offer your life to someone unless you get something out of it. You want safety, you want protection, you want some sort of assurance that you have a place in that entire order. And that is really what is really important about animal packs, about animal herds, that there is, as they call it, the pecking order. And the length of the neck can, I think, be connected to all of these things. It can be connected to this idea of a society that is, rising above the pure animalistic, or how should I say, pure natural chaos I shouldn't say animalistic because we just spent 10 minutes talking about the animalistic order, so not, but just the pure, undefined, indistinguishable chaos. If you are willing to offer your neck to another person, if you have a very long neck to be offered, this speaks of your vulnerability, but it also speaks of you existing in the world where you can be vulnerable, where this is not an existential threat. And if we have very long necks, then it speaks of a certain idea of elegance. And elegance is only made possible in these circumstances where you are protected, where you are sheltered, and where you have surplus enough to be able to, well, grow such thing as elegance. So you are protected, you have safety, and out of safety, you and of certain amount of wealth that produces safety, you can create elegance. Now, these are all interesting to talk about if, we are talking about something that is, 4,600 years old, but still. It's basically how we get to connect elegance and differentiation from the notion of chaos, how we can produce the idea of structure and of hierarchy, and how we can see this as being representative of societal order. Although this order exists in the animal world as well, in the natural world. So this is a really important thing. Now, if we're talking about the connection between the length of necks and the animal kingdom and how this whole idea comes from the animal kingdom, we absolutely have to address influences that come from Mesopotamia and that come from, basically Sumerian culture. This is something that predates even Egypt. And this is something that we can see in the first pharaoh plaque, the Narmer's plaque. We can see two animals that have extremely long necks. These are called serpentines. And these are, the obvious influence of a Sumeric culture that lingered on in Egypt until they moved away and started using their own local symbols. Mythical, possibly non-existing animals, fantastic beasts. The whole point being that we can talk about this whole idea of subjugation and of dominion and of, creation of a society around the vertical axis if we are talking about these fantastic animals and if we're talking about this keen connection that exists between the human and the animal world. Now, again, to just quickly go back to the whole Egyptian thing that exerted a certain influence over this society, because as we saw, instruments were, came from the Middle East, and then we can say that this society, on account of its geographical location, obviously was in touch with the rest of the world as it was in this particular region. We are talking about this whole idea of animals being integrated into the civilization in a very different manner, and humans seeing themselves as integrated into the civilization in a very different manner. Now, we want to say that what makes these so important for us is this whole idea that they are abstracted to a certain extent. This is also what made them so interesting for Modigliani. This is what made them so interesting for Cézanne. Now, the connection between Cézanne and these figurines is not quite as obvious as it is with Modigliani, but if you look at a lot of his portraits, you can see that this is essentially what he's doing. Like, he's making incredibly flat faces. He's trying to deconstruct the human face down to its barest necessities. And he's trying to, again, use the least available number of visual means to communicate the maximum of message. Now, this would be an incredibly anachronous a posteriori interpretation of an artifact that came from a completely different society, but it is one of the possibilities, not the only possibility, that these people saw it the same way, that they wanted to communicate the most with using, as simple representation as possible. And again, we can never fully compare, let's say, Cézanne's or Modigliani's art with these, because Cézanne's or Modigliani's art could have never been as important as this is. You're not going to gather an entire community around a fire and look at Cézanne's painting. I mean, and you're not going to do that every day or once a week it's just not going to happen. I mean, you can be the greatest lover of museums in the world. You can have great appreciation for Impressionism or Post-Impressionism, or specifically the line of Cézanne's art that you can look at as Proto-Cubism. You can have all the appreciation in the world for this, and you can share that with your offspring, and you can have familial visits to museums, but it's never going to be quite as important. You're never going to have an entire community that worships Cézanne. This is just not going to happen, or any other artist for that matter. We can never, again, fully compare what this represents to any of the artists that existed, well, in the previous couple of thousands of years. And this is one of the reasons why these people, again, Modigliani and Cézanne and Brancusi and the others, were so fascinated by these, because they understood that these were somehow more important than anything they could ever create. This is why they saw them as such a strong inspiration, especially when it comes to Cézanne and his whole connection with the Mediterranean basin, and with his fascination with the Orthodox icon and the particular kind of light and all of those things. Now, since we are running out of time here, we only have like 6 minutes left, we need to start talking about how they are made. There was this whole thing about the mask that I was going to go into, but I think it's previously covered in one of our previous lectures where we're talking about a mask of La Roche-Cotard, so you can go and look at it there. But what is really important here is how they were made. How is the face represented? Now, you can see from today's available version of this statuette that it has a nose integrated into the rest of the body, whereas previously we can see traces of paint that eyes and hair were painted on. And this immediately, of course, makes us think of Angazal figures where eyes were painted on again. And this is an interesting thing. Like, we have this whole idea of a nose being integrated into the material out of which the whole statuette is made from, whereas the eyes are added later. And of course, with time, this paint has faded away. Now, would this suggest that nose is somehow more important than the eyes were? Or would this suggest that eyes are perhaps more important? From today's perspective, we say that eyes are the mirror of the soul. So there's something really important about eyes. And we can say that, oh, you can read a lot of person's intent, or how they feel, or how they are acting. You can see a lot of it in their eyes. And you can see this in history of art. One of my all-time favorite paintings that is present in the Louvre Museum is Giovanni Bellini's Christ Blessing, that has incredibly expressive eyes. Like, that's really the most important thing about that painting. And if we're thinking about these people making this statue that obviously is engaged in the act of communal education and culture sharing and traditional, perpetuation of what that community is, we can say that, okay, nose is a part of the body, it's a part of the, well, it's made of stone, whereas eyes are painted on. And I don't think we can have a solid answer. I don't think we can really determine if this is because eyes are more or less important. We can possibly say that since hair was also painted on, that, this may help us to understand, because hair is something that is, well, more transitory than noses are. Some people lose their hair as they grow old. Some lose it while they're still young. I mean, even if you don't lose your hair, it will go gray, it will change. And even if you don't go bald, I mean, naturally, in most cases, your hair will just not be as great as it was when you were in your early 20s, when you were, let's say, in your 50s or 60s. So we can say that whereas noses keep on growing. This is a unsettling fact that throughout our life, our noses and our ears, they just keep growing. So it's to say that the hair is more transitory than the nose is. The nose really is where it is. I mean, it's not necessarily made of bone. It's made of a different kind of cartilage. But it's there unless you remove it for whichever reason. So we can say that if they applied hair and eyes using the same technique, this is to tell us something about the importance of a nose. And then that takes us back to this whole biblical creation myth that God created humans by breathing in the breath, anima, right, the life itself, through the nose. And we can assume that this is what happened here, that the noses are made more important. They're integrated with the rest of the body for this particular reason. And this is something that makes us think about the Angazal statues that have painted on eyes, but not noses not as clearly defined as these ones are. But still, even if you think about the very materials used, I mean, paint is not quite the same as marble. Marble is just more durable than any kind of paint that you can use. Now, I find this interesting from today's perspective because we tend to say that eyes are the mirror of the soul, and we tend to think that soul is something that is eternal, whereas body is something that is temporal and corruptible and all these things. This would suggest a completely different optics. This would suggest the longevity of the body and temporality of the soul. Because again, the eyes are painted on and the paint has evaporated. Now, when we were talking about one of the previous lectures, Egyptian artifacts, we were talking about how all of those were painted and how in some of those cases the paint was meant to evaporate, how the paint was meant to disappear because that would reveal then the black color that would make us think of Osiris and all these other things. We can't tell if this was the case here because these are not black, these are white. This is marble. But still, it's something that we need to think about and something that we need to take into consideration. Perhaps nose was really seen as more important than the eyes were. Now, since our time is almost entirely up, I think this is the good way for us to conclude this. We're going to be talking about one of my personal favorite topics in this entire course. Next, it's going to be the so-called La Parisienne, the Parisian girl from Minoan art, and we're going to see how this is a step away from what we were talking about here, but how certain things are still maintained. Okay, I thank you for your attention. I congratulate you that you lasted this long with us, and I certainly hope to see you again soon. Have a nice day, and bye.